Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valen Kalika, and I'll be your host for today. So before we start, we'll go over a few reminders and over a few webinar flows here. But first and foremost, some in regards to the troubleshooting, the connection issues with Microsoft Teams. I would like just to provide you some two troubleshoots here. If you're using the web browser version of Teams, please refresh your browser. If you're using the desktop app of Teams, please exit and rejoin. These two seem to resolve most of the connection issues with our hosting platform here. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/security-webinars. Now we have closed captions in several languages available during this live broadcast, and you can enable them by clicking on the CC button located at the lower right corner of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window by clicking on the Ask a Question button. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. Now, for our followers and for those of you who are viewing us for the first time, it was back in March of this year when we kicked off the first session of a webinar series on diversity in cybersecurity. And today, for the second time now, we'll be going over the same topic with Sarah Young's story. Sarah has worked in the tech industry for about a decade now, and but her story on where she is today is quite unconventional. And Sarah is here today with us to share her story. And without further ado, I'll pass the mic to her. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Valon, and hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. If you've ever listened to one of my webinars before on security community, you'll know that for me right now it's 3 o'clock in the morning, so or just afterwards. So thanks for making the time. I'll try to stay awake and sound. What's the word I'm looking for? Sound actually not like it's the middle of the night. But thanks everyone for taking the time. I do really appreciate it. And as well, if you're listening to this on the recording, also I very much appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. So yeah, as Valon said, I'm going to be talking about my path into tech. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some diversity, some things that I've noted about diversity in the workplace in the last few years. Now, before we start, I'll say I'll stress that when I talk about diversity, I know there are many aspects to it. Diversity is not just a gender thing. It can be background, it can be faith, it can be ethnicity. There's all kinds of things that diversity mean to different people. When I talk about diversity, I'll often talk about gender because that is my personal experience of being sort of being in a minority. For me, it's gender. I do think what I'm talking about though does hold true for other types of minorities in tech. But as I said, you know, just to stress, my personal experience is more specifically about gender, as I am a lady. The other thing I'll just mention before we get going is that one of my lovely teammates, Ryan, we were having some technical difficulties sharing slides on Teams. I don't know what my Teams is doing. Clearly it doesn't want to be up at 3 o'clock in the morning. So Ryan's going to be, he is very kindly like moving slides for me. So I do apologize in advance if I have to keep saying, Ryan, can you move on a second? And with that, Ryan, would you be able to move on to the next slides? So if you just give it a couple of clicks, Ryan, on this slide, you'll see that officially, no, that's thank you. So no, other way, leave it there. Thank you. So I'm actually, as I said, based in Wellington at the moment. Officially, I actually do live in Melbourne. It's a long story. I'm a bit of a COVID refugee. Yeah, I do actually officially work in Microsoft in Australia. I was back in Melbourne for the first time in over a year, a couple of weeks ago, which was great. But for the time being, I'm just kind of hiding out from COVID in Wellington. For those of you who are familiar with this part of the world, we've been very, very lucky, and well, that we shut our borders and we live a relatively COVID-free life, which is not what everyone can say. So yeah, and if you didn't know where Melbourne and Wellington are, there you go. Melbourne is the southeast of Australia, and Wellington is the bottom of the North Island of New Zealand. So yeah, quick geography lesson. Moving on to the next slide. Just quickly about who I am. This is me and my dog. He's currently asleep. Normally, if I turned the camera on, I would normally put him on a webinar, but I feel mean at this time in the morning. My name's Sarah Young. I'm a senior program manager in customer experience engineering. So I focus on Azure Sentinel. I've done a couple of webinars on the security community, on some various different bits of Sentinel. I try and do a webinar every now and again when I feel like I can get up for an hour in the middle of the night. As I said, I live somewhere between Australia and New Zealand. I've been working in tech for about a decade. So yeah, that's me at the moment. I did used to do pre-COVID a lot of conferences and talks. Obviously, I do them online now because we don't have so many things in real life. But I do really enjoy talking to the community and doing these webinars. And just because we started this diversity initiative and diversity series, as Valon was talking about, I really wanted to this is actually an updated version of a talk I did some time ago about diversity in tech and my particular journey. I'm not saying mine is super special, but hey, I think the more stories we share about how different people get into tech, I think that's a really positive thing. And a quick, as I said, I know there are people watching from all over the world. So next couple of slides are just a note for you because I get asked this a lot. So Ryan, if you could move on. And if you want to click through all the pictures, why not? Just so you know, yes, Australia, everything, I get asked this a lot. Like, yes, everything in Australia is trying to kill you. So we have crocodiles, we have spiders, we have deadly octopi, we have jellyfish, and yes, all of those things are trying to kill you. But last but not least, we've got the really ripped kangaroos as well. That is a real kangaroo called Roger. If you don't know anything about red kangaroos, the males are really ripped, as you can see, and they just crush things because yeah. So I get asked this a lot when I'm talking to people from all over the world. That is it true that a lot of wildlife in Australia is trying to kill you? Yes, but to be honest with you, if you live in a big city, you don't see this. And last one on this slide, though, the very last one is cockatoos. Like, they come from Australia and yeah, they drink beer, so there you go. But next slide, please, Ryan. In summary, yes, everything in Australia is trying to kill you. I'm not actually sure if this slide is real, but I get asked a lot about it. So, and when COVID's over, I very much encourage you to come down and visit Australia and New Zealand. So moving on though to my actual talk. What am I actually going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about my path. I didn't have a standard start into IT. In tech, I don't have any tertiary qualifications in tech, and I've worked in security now for the last 6 years, and then before that I'll talk about it, I was doing other bits of technology, but I wanted to do a few things with this talk. I just wanted to tell you my story and give you an insight into some of the research I've done about diversity, and is there a standard path into tech, and how do diverse candidates influence the workplace? And on the other side of things, I've talked to some of my colleagues and my friends in industry about how hiring managers struggle and what the challenges are around hiring. But before, again, bit of a note before I properly start, I don't claim that my research is all encompassing or scientifically correct. I'm one lady who did this in my own time. It's definitely not a scientific methodology, but again, I wanted to give you a snapshot into what I found, and it's more, as I said, it's not a scientific methodology. I'm certainly not presenting to you my research in that sense, but hopefully it'll give you some things to think about. So we'll just start with my path into tech. And so now we're going to go through lots of cringy slides. So for the first one, if you can move on to the next slide, Ryan, here's me. I think I'm 10 in this photo. I'm about 10 anyway. The rabbit I'm sat with is called Stripey. He was my rabbit. He was my main man when I was about 10 years old. I was a big video game nerd from the word go. I also really liked, I should have added it into this presentation, maybe. I've actually still got my first ever PowerPoint presentation that I made when I was 11. For some reason, I've managed to keep that file going throughout when I've moved my files and moved computers, and it is a slideshow about my rabbit. That's him there. But I mean, I've always enjoyed tech. So I used to download totally legit copies of Pokemon games to emulate them on my machine, on my personal computer. And I learned hexadecimal from altering the hex value of one line of the code in Pokemon to make different Pokemon appear. So for those of you who aren't familiar, hexadecimal is a way of counting from 0 to 256. At the time, there were only, first 151 and then 251 Pokemon, which means it all fit very nicely in that one variable. And so, yeah, this is probably my first sort of dipping into code, more technical things and just turning on a computer. But I've always been a big fan. I used to like to enjoy getting paper jams out of printers and things like that. So, you know, always been more technically inclined, we should say. But then I'll show you teenage Sarah picture. We're moving on a bit. So, oh my goodness. So this is a picture of me. I was 18 in this picture. I was picking my exams, my final, again, I know it depends on where you are in the world, but generally, no matter where you are, you tend to choose some subjects, maybe around 15, 16, that you specialize in, and what you pick will probably determine what you do at university. So, I mean, when I was, and I did do IT, I did do tech. I remember being very upset that we only had Windows 95 at the time, and I was at home. I had Windows 98, so I wasn't super happy about that. I did get thrown out of IT when I was 14 because I wrote a website, I wrote a website. Me and my friend were writing websites, and I wrote the We Hate Rachel page, and she wrote the We Hate Sarah page. We don't know why. I can't even remember why we did this. We just thought it was funny. And my IT teacher actually chucked me out of IT for that. But what was really annoying was that when she was checking our degrees, she was checking our websites. She got to me first, and by the time she'd finished telling me off, my friend had changed all of hers to the We Love Sarah website and never got in trouble. I'll always remember that. Very annoying. But I didn't want to commit to doing IT as a tertiary thing. Or any other kind of technical degree, because I was scared. I thought, oh no, if I commit to doing IT, if I pick an IT degree, then that's the only thing I'm going to be able to do. And at the time, I really was not into committing to. I wasn't into committing to a particular degree. And yeah, this is a very embarrassing picture of me in front of the vending machine. The reason this picture exists is because I used to fill the vending machine. It was my job, and so I got a picture of it when I was leaving school because it was my baby. I know it's a bit strange. Moving on though, so what I did instead was when I went to university, I actually did a history degree, because that's an obvious choice, right, for someone who's more technically minded. I was warned by my parents, my teachers, that probably a tech degree would be better for me, but hey, I still decided, you know, that you know, I was going to do history because I thought it was a nice non-committal degree, and in all fairness to my history degree, it was very good. It taught me to write, and not lots of people in IT can write, but probably in terms of helping me in tech, it's probably not the best thing. I think I realized probably about in my first year that maybe history was the wrong choice for me, because I didn't have much in common with my course mates, and I wasn't really that interested, but I could certainly do it. I wasn't failing, and because in the UK at the time where I was studying, if I'd have quit my degree and started again, I would have had to pay more expensive tuition fees. I didn't want to do that, and so I just decided to stick with it. And as you can see, here's me getting my degree. Happy days. I did you know, I did finish my degree, and I got a good degree. And I can see just in the Q&A there, Cassie said she got a history major and went into tech. No, I totally agree with you, and I'll get onto that. Why history hasn't been a bad degree for me, but possibly not the standard thing. Anyway, finish university, and this is me. I went on a gap year. So this is sometimes called, in this part of the world, it's called an OE, or an overseas experience. I know that it's not something that's normal in certain parts of the world. So just in case you're unfamiliar with the concept, basically a gap year is when you either before university or just after university, rather than going to study or going into the workplace, you basically take a year off. And some people will travel and just travel around the world, and some people might go do volunteering. You know, it's a chance to do something that you wouldn't normally do. So for me, I went to New Zealand, actually where I am now, and I went to work in a school. So this was me in a school. I wasn't a teacher. I'm still not a teacher, so I wasn't allowed to teach per se, but I did teaching. I helped out being a teaching assistant, and I ended up doing a lot of the school IT work. I ended up doing a lot of mail merges and just writing school letters and things like that. And I ended up, I think, if you have an aptitude for something, you will end up gravitating towards it anyway. So I ended up doing a lot of random bits and stuff in New Zealand. Anyway, that was my little gap year. So this was 2009. And then you might be asking, if we can move on to the next slide, Ryan. So how the heck did you actually end up in IT, Sarah? Because so far, to be honest with you, all I've been doing is some glorified office work, rather than probably what we'd call real tech. But you know, never discount your experience. That's what I'd say to you. If you're listening and you want to get into tech, and you're just doing you know, some office admin stuff, you know, it's still using a computer, it's still technical. You know, don't discount any experience that you've got. That's what I would say to you. And then moving on, this is my first IT job. So when I came back from New Zealand, this is me at my work Christmas party. When I came back from New Zealand, I realized that I was going to go to law school, but then I decided that I wouldn't, because I really wanted to work internationally, and I knew that if I did law, which is what I was thinking of doing, that law is of course very specific to the country and the jurisdiction you live in, and so you always have to retrain in that country's laws. So I was like, oh, I don't think I can do that if I want to go live in another country. And I finally decided, after all of that, to do IT. So I was like, fine, I'm committing to IT because I'm committing to IT because this is flexible for me. And I managed to get a job, my very first IT job, which was first line support desk, working at working at the local IT company, we were managed service providers, and we did manage DSLs, manage backups, and we even had like hosted data center. So obviously, you can see the age. you can see the age of myself here, being that of course now no one offers managed data center stuff anymore, of course, because everything is cloud. But this was just before cloud became a thing. And this is where I learned to do Cisco things. I did my CCNA, I did ITIL Foundation, I did my Service Desk Analyst certificate. And I spent a lot of time though, having to study in my own time. And I just used free resources. I mean, there's far more now than there used to be online, to sort of get myself up to speed. Because I can remember, you know, somebody calling me and saying, "Oh, my MPLS phone doesn't work," and I was like, "What?" I've since an MPLS. I mean, an MPLS phone. No, an MPLS, of course, it's just to do with the connection. If you're not familiar with that phrase, there's no such real thing really as an MPLS phone. I have learned since then, but it was basically an IP phone. Then moving on from my first IT job, about 18 months later, I got on a night shift that I was on, I decided to apply for a graduate scheme in London with Accenture, and I actually got in, and I started doing big pan-European infrastructure transformations. Now, this is me in Chicago on my analyst. We were called, all the graduates were called analysts, and this was me in Chicago doing my training. We did 2 weeks in Chicago, and I remember that was my first ever work trip abroad. I was very, very excited. It felt very, very glamorous to be taking a work trip abroad. And yeah, that was me in Chicago. And I started doing big pan-European infrastructure transformations. Now, of course, we don't really do infrastructure transformation in the same way anymore, because of course, most things are cloud, because we did a data center refresh. We were doing LAN and WAN transformations, which arguably maybe you'll still do. But that's how I really started moving into an infrastructure, doing infrastructure pieces of work. Spent a lot of time on Cisco phones. Don't know if anyone's ever had the pleasure of working on a Cisco Call Manager. That is something I still dearly love, even to this day, because I spend a lot of time on it. And then you might wonder after this, like, so how did you get into security specifically, Sarah? So if we move on to the next slide, to be honest with you, I'm gonna speak quite frankly, I didn't move into security as a sort of calculated choice. It happened by accident. So here's a picture of me. This was, well, you can see it was 2019. It was a couple of years ago, because of course there's not been an awful lot of in-person events recently, of course, for obvious reasons. But I ended up in security because I finally got what I needed, which what I wanted, which was to move internationally, which is always what I've been working to. And I came back to New Zealand, and when I got to New Zealand, I started working for EY, and I got the job, and it was a very short interview. They basically were like, "Oh, you've worked for Accenture for 3 years. Oh, you'll be good over here. You can do the same thing." But when I got here, I found that I really didn't. They actually didn't do the same kind of work. New Zealand, if you don't know, is a very small country, and there's only 5 million people who live here. Like, businesses are not as big as in other places, and so there's not generally the appetite for these big transformations. But they said to me, "Oh, you're technical, right? Can you go help the security people then?" And I remember at the time, this was 2013, 2014. I was like, "Oh, I don't want to. I don't like, security wasn't cool." Now, I know that we all know that security now is very cool. It's trendy. Lots of people want to work in it. And I think that's great, by the way. But at the time, it really wasn't. And I was kind of like, okay, sure, I guess so. Wasn't super excited about it, I have to admit, at the time. But I really wanted to go back and do my network pieces of work and deploy my phones and routers and switches. But anyway, that was what was on offer, so that's what I did. And I realized working in security that after a couple of years, well, even a couple of projects, I realized that, hey, security is actually really interesting, and there's loads and loads of stuff to do, and certainly there's way more opportunities in this than probably what I was doing previously. And that's how I ended up in security, because after I worked for EY for a couple of years, I worked for a bank here in New Zealand, and then I worked for, I moved to Australia, I worked for a cloud consultancy, and then finally I got tapped on the shoulder by Microsoft to interview for a role, which was not the role I do now, it was the one before, and that was late 2018, and that's how I ended up here and where I am today. I will say though something, again, for those of you who are out there, doing, if you're job hunting at the moment or when you look to move, I'll say that, like, pretty much every company I've worked for, on reflection, there's only 2 companies, actually probably only 50%. So I'm trying to think now. When I've applied for jobs, I've been rejected for a job by Microsoft at least 3 times in my sort of 10 years in tech. I was rejected by EY at some point as well. I was rejected by Accenture. So point being here, I just wanted to say, if you're don't be disheartened necessarily when you if you apply for a role with a company and you don't get it. Don't let that put you off from applying again at a later date, because things might have changed, the role might have changed, you will have changed. So yeah, it's something that I always, when I tell my story, I just call out. I have definitely been rejected by Microsoft several times, even to the point of not even getting a first round interview. So everything comes in swings and roundabouts, and I know, like, it's a competitive market, but there are a lot of security jobs, but there are a lot of people wanting to get into security. So obviously, if you're out there and you're looking for roles, like, keep going, because as I said, it's happened to me. I just wanted to look though, for the rest of the time, at some of this research that I did and looking at other ways into security. I'll just talk a little bit about the main routes that we have, that I see into security, that most people will probably jump to. So if you can look at the next slide, please, Ryan. One is, there's some obvious ones here. Obviously, there's tertiary training in security. That's changed a lot as well. There are now actual cybersecurity degrees. I know when I was studying, that wasn't a thing. You could have computer science or similar, which is, of course, my second bullet point there. The other routes into security are transitioning from another part of IT, which is what I did, and there's on-the-job training as well, like an apprenticeship. And that's something we've seen an awful lot more of, particularly because, again, I don't think it matters where you are in the world. Well, maybe a little bit. I know there are a few countries where it's still cheap or it's funded by the government, but tertiary training can be very expensive, and not everyone is in a position to be able to pay for that, for a variety of reasons. So and as it becomes more expensive, obviously it prices more people out. So we're seeing a lot more on-the-job training, which I think is really interesting as well. I know that a lot of companies now, big corporates are running apprenticeship type schemes where you don't have to have a college degree or anything tertiary, and you come in and they train you on the job, and maybe you do study on the side. So if you're in that position where you don't want to take on, or maybe you just don't want to take on the burden of a lot of college debt, which can be tough, definitely look for other things out there, because there definitely are. I'd say the proportions of these different routes into security have changed as well. I know that definitely 5-10 years ago, pretty much everyone from security just came in from another part of IT. They would have been working doing something else and they moved into security. Whereas now I think we see a greater proportion of people coming straight into security having done study specifically in that area. So it's really interesting how the proportions have changed. But moving on, you know, is there a standard path to security out there? It's a good question. I'm not really sure there is, to be honest. So looking at my next slide, I'd probably say maybe. I would say the older you are, and I include myself in this, and I wouldn't say I'm probably not old in the grand scheme of things, but you know, the older you are, the less likely you are to have been able to have access to tertiary and formal training in security, because that's really only popped up, I'd say, in the last 5 years. Security training has only been heavily formalized in the past few years, and I'd say probably roughly 50% of the people who I know, again, as I said, this is not scientific, you know, probably have a comp sci degree or some kind of degree, but it wouldn't even be security specific. So I wouldn't say this isn't, I haven't broken this down more specifically into age groups. It's something that I want to do, but certainly I think that yeah, a lot of people, so if you're starting out in security, don't think that everybody's like really well qualified in security, because I can guarantee you they're not. It's a really interesting thing. So moving on though, we'll just look a little bit at the who and the what of diversity. So again, I speak very much to my own experience here. So if it's not something, as I said, my experience is specific to me in terms of I see it very much in a gender sense, but I know that diversity is a lot more than that. Now, obviously, we can't kind of ask this question, but feel because we're not in the room. But moving to my question, but I've seen there's some people in the chat anyway who've been already chatting about this, and that's great. Just have a think. You know, who considers themselves? Can you put hands up on a live? I can't remember if you can. You know, who, if you're listening, you know, do you consider yourself to have had I call it non-linear career path into security? I'd say linear is probably, you know, just going to school, studying, doing all the things, always being very focused. I'm sure most of you, if you're in security, and even if you're thinking about getting into it, probably aren't, you know, you haven't had a linear path. But let's break it down a bit more. I just wanted to tell you a couple of real life stories of some of my friends. So on the next slide, I'll just tell you about some of my friends who I am quite who I know quite well. I had a friend who was a business continuity planner. I think that one kind of lends itself quite well, actually, because of course we know that security is kind of planning for disasters. There's actually a lady I know in Melbourne who was a nurse, and she retrained in her own time to just up her knowledge of basic IT concepts, but she's a nurse. And I also know an accountant who was working for a Big Four, and she was, if you're not familiar with the Big Four consultancies, they do taxing and accountancy, but they often have a bit of audit, which can start to go into security. And she decided that's where she wanted to go and moved, and was doing tech, decided to do security as well. So I mean, again, this is just a couple of people that I know. One of my colleagues here, who's on the call, Sarah. I don't know if you want to come off mute, but I just discovered that Sarah was an opera singer before she started working in tech, which is probably the coolest thing I've ever heard.
Yes, I think I'm off mute. Yes, I was. I was an opera singer for about 7 or 8 years before I went into tech.
That's so cool. That is probably one of the coolest, like, more non-linear careers I've ever heard of.
Thank you. Well, actually, I've met a lot of musicians that are in tech, a lot of like similar skill sets, like that you don't think about that transition, like pattern recognition, for example. Like we're trained in that for music theory, and it applies directly to tech, just in a different way.
Yeah, that's a great feedback. Also, one coming in from the audience here about the music and technology. So she's saying that NSA at one time recruited music majors as analysts because they were used to thinking in abstract ways. So that's incredible.
I like that. And it's true too. Like a lot of like what I did in tech, like I would approach things from what I was told was like, oh, you're very out of the box, but really it was like we're taught to look at things from a bunch of different angles anyway, and yeah, we're just used to it. So
yeah, because I would say, although like I said, I've done history, I would definitely say that I am still I was quite a logical thinker, to be fair. I'm a very logical thinker, so I'm quite standard in that way. But in fact, and this comes really nicely onto our next slide, actually. Like again, diversity is so important because as we've just talked about, and other people have been saying, I've seen in the Q&A, well, you know, having diversity of thought is really, really important for security because, you know, the more diverse you are, the more diverse your thought is. And of course, attackers and security, attackers and people who are, you know, are always looking for new ways. Like as defenders, we will come up with a way to stop and, you know, stop an attacker or a particular type of attack, and then they find a way to get around it. So we've always got to have this. We've always got to try and stay one step ahead. I can't believe, by the way, how many music people are listening, which is awesome. But I also think it's important for from a recruiting perspective as well, the more people, I'm a big believer in you can't be what you can't see, which is why I've sort of tried to, where possible, you know, tell my story and put myself out there. I'm not saying mine is particularly exciting, but I know that having for me, having people I could relate to, and relating can mean lots of different things, right? You know, just because someone is a lady or identifies as female doesn't mean I will relate to them necessarily, because you relate to people on many different levels. It can be gender, background, you know, religion, all kinds of things. But of course, I do think it's great. The more people stand up and tell their stories. So anybody out there who's got the opportunity, I really recommend you do, whether it's blogging or talking or whatever, because for people coming into tech, the more sort of role model options they have, the better. Because I know that definitely sort of 5-6 years ago, there weren't that many people I felt like who were, you know, maybe 5 to 10 years on in their career who I felt I could relate to. Yeah, and then that hopefully precipitates a bit of a domino effect in terms of you know, that we can, you know, if more like, because I know for a fact, and again, I only talk from more of the experience I have, is that if you just see at a recruiting stand at college, at a college thing or whatever, just a load of white middle-aged guys, if you're not a white middle-aged guy or a white guy, you might not feel comfortable approaching them to talk about careers or whatever. So, you know, there is a bit of a domino effect. The more ladies or diverse people you see, the more people are encouraged to actually apply and see themselves as part of a team, which is really important. And then the other side of that, though, and workplace influences number 2, I've called it very originally, on my next slide, is we've got to remember, and diversity is really important, but it is important to remember that the culture needs to be managed properly here. So, you know, it's not, you know, when I say it's not always positive, of course, diversity is a positive thing. But if you feel in a team that maybe you're the token diverse candidate, a token diverse team member, that can actually be quite isolating. So this is something that is a challenge for managers, and I still think it's a challenge today, is that, you know, you've got to drive home inclusive practices and social events, not just based on drinking, for example, things like that, or always doing social events maybe after hours if someone needs to go home, and so the culture needs to be managed properly as well. Just sort of hiring someone who's diverse in inverted commas and just putting them in a team really isn't usually enough. But this is, a tricky thing. And anyone who's a manager of a team or thinking of managing a team, it's definitely a challenge as well. And that leads us nicely onto the hiring manager's perspective. Now, I'm not a hiring manager. I don't manage people at the moment. So again, but I know many people who do. And there's a couple of challenges here around creating diversity, which I wanted to call out just because it's all well and good saying we should be diverse, and we should, but it's not always that easy. So on my next slide, you can see, and if any of you have been involved in a hiring process or been a hiring manager, where do you even start with creating more diverse teams? I know from looking at when you have a job application, there's, again, I speak in terms of gender, but usually there's a lot of guys. There's probably, way more guys than ladies applying. So, there's an obvious disadvantage to start with. And also, hiring processes do tend to lend themselves to accessing candidates that have got more traditional pathways. If I look at my job description for when I joined Microsoft, the role that I took when I joined Microsoft, like, I read the job description, and if I'd have read that job description and actually applied rather than been invited to apply and asked to apply, I definitely wouldn't have taken the job. I wouldn't have applied for the job because I would have been like, oh, look, it says I need a comp sci degree, and there were all these other things. And so hiring, and that's not a specific Microsoft problem, just hiring processes generally tend to lend themselves to traditional pathways because that's how they've always been written in the past. And so again, if you're hiring, I know that one of the last things you want to do is write a big long job description. But and often people will copy and paste things that have been done before, but certainly if you've got any influence on your hiring processes, definitely look at your job description and see if it is if it is sort of excluding people or putting people off. If you so rather than saying you must have a computer science degree or a security degree, maybe you say maybe it's put or equivalent. You can literally change the tone of that maybe by just adding a little bit at the end, a caveat saying or equivalent experience, because that will immediately, I know if I read that, I'd be like, oh, okay, cool. So I don't need to have that. So definitely think about how you write those things, because I think we know that, again, I know this is a gender thing, but we know that women, there's lots of research that shows that a guy will, a more masculine trait is to apply for a job when you've only got like 50% of the requirements, whereas people who identify as female are more likely to not want to apply for a job unless they've got sort of 85 to 90% of the requirements. So always remember that. But again, don't just think of it in terms of gender. And then last point I wanted to make here is building on that, accessing the right candidates. Oh, right. Thanks, Ryan. What do you do when diverse candidates don't apply? Because that's definitely a thing. Do you go and look for them, or do you get your recruiters to go find people, or do you go do more outreach to go into those community groups? Positive discrimination doesn't always work. I know in a previous job in a previous company I worked in, they had to interview a female candidate, whether or not, even if, and what that meant was it was done for the best of intentions, but sometimes I remember my boss told me that he had to interview a lady because she was the only female who'd applied for the role, and she didn't really have the skills, because I'm not personally in favor of, I would never want to be given a job just because I was a woman and just because I was diverse, as opposed to having the right skills. But he had to put her through the whole interview process, even when he didn't really have an intention to hire her because HR said you had to do that. And I personally don't think that's fair on, and it's not something that we do at Microsoft, thankfully, but that is bad positive discrimination because it wasted her time, it wasted our time to interview her. And so again, it's a tricky one. And again, I like I said, I'm no expert. I'm just talking about this to give you some thoughts. As well, things like job descriptions will say you need to have your CISSP, you need to have your CISM. Those are expensive exams, those are really expensive exams. And to be honest with you, if you've not got an employer paying for them, you probably don't want to do them, or it might be difficult for you to do them. I think a CISSP exam is about $600 just to take the exam nowadays. So, like having a huge list of exams as well isn't the best thing to do there either. Anyway, just for my conclusions, as I said, this is Sarah sort of rambling about her thoughts on diversity, but just to conclude, firstly, I know there's a ton of people on here, so firstly, celebrate your non-linear path into security. Ryan, next page, please, next slide. You celebrate your non-linear path into security. I think there's a ton of people on this call, and if you're listening later, be proud and talk about, please, share with people if you have an opportunity to go speak to students or people trying to get into the field, or even blog about it so anyone can get into it, please do. That's awesome. And I'd say next point being there isn't a standard path into security. I think things will become more standardized as time goes on, in terms of we're going to have more security specific training, which is an obvious way to go. But just because of that, let's not forget about all the different candidates. We need different mindsets. We need different types of people. It's important for our diversity of thought, and it makes us more effective at actually doing, ultimately what we're all here to do, which is to protect our businesses from attackers. Next one is diversity and breadth of experience definitely makes teams more engaged, and when it's done properly. There's a caveat. When it's done properly. So, try and if it's something you're interested in and you have time, and I would put this on everybody, even if you don't consider yourself to be someone who's sort of more niche in a diverse person, in terms of, if you're like a guy, or if you're white or whatever, that doesn't mean that you can't get involved in this sort of stuff. What I found in previous companies I've worked for is that a lot of onus was put on me, me and the women, the females in the team, and they'd say, oh, well, you need to do this thing for women, and I would say, well, why do I just have to do it? Diversity is something we should all take responsibility for. Everyone in the team should help with this, not just me and the females. So remember that, and just because you may not consider yourself to be someone who ticks a box for diversity doesn't mean you can't get involved. In fact, I really strongly encourage you to get involved, because it's fun, and it's good for you to broaden your understanding. Recently, I talked to a colleague on my team. He comes from a minority background that traditionally is considered to be quite underrepresented, and particularly and aren't considered to be a particularly high achieving nationality, and I didn't know anything about that at all, and I didn't realize that people would discriminate based on his background, because I was just like, oh, he's a guy in tech, he'll be fine. People would have, I say discriminate, or probably more fair to say preconceptions about him and the community that he came from. So certainly it's there's more to diversity than meets the eye. So, ask questions and learn about people, because it's really interesting. And then last but not least, if you're a manager, don't forget that hiring in a diverse manner is hard. I mean, it is hard. So if you're looking at your team or your organization, it is tough. So it can take time. So keep going, and because this isn't a problem that's going to be solved overnight. We've made some really great strides, and I know from people who've worked in tech for maybe 20-25 years, there's a significant difference. I would say even in my 10 years there's a difference, but there's still a ways to go. So we've got to sort of keep going with these things. And thank you, everyone. I can't believe I actually managed to fill the time in the end. Hooray. I know we started a little bit late, but if there's thank you all for listening. I hope this was interesting. It's been a while since I've done a presentation that wasn't technical. As I said, I hope you enjoyed it. We do have some communities in Microsoft. We have Humans of IT, and we also have community mentors. The links are below. So if you're interested, go and check them out. Thank you very much. I've seen lots of there's been lots of chat in the Q&A I've seen going past, so I'm glad to see that this is a topic that interests people, thanks very much for your attention.
Great, thank you, Sarah. My first question is, did you manage to wake up your dog yet?
No, he's still in bed.
Okay,
I don't want
great.
to wake him up. I feel too mean.
Okay,
Normally I would
great.
usually when I do a webinar in the daytime, I usually put him on the camera at some point because he is very cute, but I don't want to wake him up at 4 in the morning. It seems cruel.
Okay, well, seems like we have a theme of questions around the cybersecurity path, and specifically if there's one available inside Microsoft that the folks can follow as a learning path or a career path.
So this is actually very well timed, because very recently, in the last month or two, Microsoft just released a host of new exams, and they're security focused, and there's about 4 of them. The first one you should look up is SC 900. SC 900 is your security and identity fundamentals. These are all, and we all have MS Learn. We have MS Learn. I can probably find them whilst I'm talking if I try really hard. I'm not a great multitasker, I have to say. But they all have online learning paths that are free for the online stuff. So that's something that you can definitely. I wonder, I think
I posted the right one. It's you can just look it up. It's the
Yeah, I've just put the SC 900, but there are some other ones as well. So I think, Valen, you've done the overall browsing.
Yes.
So the SC 900 that I've just put in the announcements there is the Microsoft Fundamentals security exam. It's only been released in the last month, so it's very new. But the learning materials for that, the online study materials are free, and that's definitely a good one to start with. And then there's other SC, because with Microsoft exams, if you're not familiar, they all start with 2 letters. So SC is security. So we have an identity one. There's also a security operations analyst one. So I'd start with that fundamentals, the Microsoft security compliance and identity fundamentals, and then there's definitely more that you can look at. But what I'd say is, my advice to you, whatever exams you're taking, where you can, unless you've got an employer paying for them, but if you're starting out, you might not have that luxury. There's a lot of free learning material online. Don't go spending thousands of dollars of your own money if you can avoid it, because if you just have a bit of a search around, there's a lot of sort of free to use material out there, which is legit, not anything dodgy. Because I've talked to students before where they've saved and spent so much of their own money, and I think, like, yeah, don't do that if you don't have to. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff in Microsoft land. We also have, it maybe doesn't have an exam at the end, but we have the Ninja training for all our different security products, like Microsoft Defender, Azure Sentinel. All of that is free. Most of them have webinars recorded online that you can go through. So yeah, we have a whole host of stuff, and we also have, which if you want to watch 6 hours of me on a video, well, me and Mark Simos, he's the chief security architect in Microsoft. We did a Azure security best practices, which talks about cloud security best practices in more general terms. And to be honest with you, even if you're not using Azure, most of it still holds up for other clouds because it's more theoretical. There are some Azure specific things, but that I will see if I can find it in a second, put it in the announcements. But yeah, ton of stuff that you can access without having to spend a lot of money, a lot of stuff online. So definitely go and have a look.
Great. Your slide where it talks about diversity and breadth of experience makes teams more engaged, and I'm really a strong believer of where we at today. It's all about the experiences that we have gone through, and I was trying to do, quote unquote, trying to do my homework last night, and I ran into your YouTube video and found out about your volunteer work in Zealandia, the Karori Sanctuary, which just sounded quite interesting, and I thought maybe you can share that experience with us.
Oh yeah, so so I volunteer at a wildlife sanctuary here in Wellington, where it's predator free. So for those of you who don't know, in New Zealand didn't have any mammals. New Zealand didn't have any mammals until humans introduced them. There was just reptiles and birds. So obviously humans have introduced mammals, and that's had a fairly devastating effect on the native bird life. Zealandia has it's predator free, so they've cleared all the predators and have a predator free fence, so all the native wildlife can live in peace. And I volunteer there as well. So absolutely nothing to do with tech, but it's lovely, a lovely place to go.
Great, thank you. And a last one, since we have an incredible audience here and various backgrounds, what is your call to action?
So my call to action for everyone is, I can say a couple of different, basically it's very broad because so many different circumstances here, but maybe think about how, and this doesn't matter, who you are, where you are. If you're trying to get into tech, then hopefully this has helped. Go out, use the free things. There's lots of stuff to help you, and money doesn't have to be a barrier. That's an important one. And secondly, if you're already in tech and you're working, if you're a hiring manager, then obviously think about how you can how you can help make it easy for these diverse non-linear candidates to come to your attention. And if you're just working in tech and you're not a manager, see what you can do to help diversify your workplace. Like, do you mix up? I know we don't really do social activities at the moment, it's a little bit restricted, but if you're having social things, is it always around drinking after work? Like, mix it up so different people can be involved. And lots of, there's probably a couple of call to actions. So probably my single call to action is to go and think about what your diversity specific call to action should be, depending on where you're at. But yeah, and hopefully this has just made you think more about diversity topics.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your story. This was incredible. And just wanted to remind for those who are still on the line that the best way to ensure that you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements, to please visit our landing page at aka.ms/security community. And while there, you'll find easy ways to navigate and find the resources and learning content relevant to your security products and needs. A good start would be by browsing our bite-sized product videos, the ninja trainings we have out there, recordings of past webinars, GitHub communities, and many more. We'd love to hear your feedback on how we can improve on these webinars, and you can do so by taking a minute and go to aka.ms/security webinar feedback. Thank you all for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. So we hope to see you next time. Goodbye.